Prime Minister Keir Starmer's pledge to raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP is supposed to make us safer. The more ready we are to go to war, the argument goes, the less likely we'll be attacked. But on Good Morning Britain, James Schneider challenged that logic.
It's not just a question of if you spend money, it will make us more secure. Let's look at the track record of British military policy over the last 35 years. We invaded Afghanistan, the Taliban are back in charge. We invaded Iraq, that created ISIS, made us less safe at home. We backed the overthrow of Gaddafi, causing wreckage to the whole region. We spend tens of billions of pounds on Trident. The missiles are not even ours. We have to lease them from the US. And there hasn't been a successful test launch in over a decade. So
but we're about to celebrate, after 80 years, VE Day with parties' processions, because 80 years ago, we, with our partners, fought off a fascist threat to the East through our military power. I mean, isn't that something to learn from?
Well, my point is this blank check that we are writing 2% to 2.5% to 2.6% to 3% of GDP, this blank check, is it going to make us any safer? Did Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, make us any safer?
It does seem like quite a strange, I suppose, rhetorical tactic from Ed Balls. So you've got James Schneider there saying, look, spending money on the military doesn't necessarily equal security. I mean, obviously for security, you've probably got to spend some money on the military. But there isn't a sort of one-to-one relationship. And the examples given are lots of recent military expeditions, which the UK has gone on, that have made us less safe, not more safe. And then Ed Balls says, but what about something 80 years ago? Right? The last war that we fought that everyone sort of recognises was a good war to fight. Just forget about all those wars in the meantime. Ed Balls didn't want to speak about Iraq or Afghanistan, though. He wanted to go back to the Nazis instead.
But I'm asking about Germany. I'm asking about Germany and the Second World War and a threat in Europe to our east. Is that so different from the threat to our east from Putin today?
I do think that Nazi Germany and contemporary Russia are really rather different.
Right.
I mean,
so defend Putin then. No,
I'm sorry. Just because you don't think that someone is the same as Hitler doesn't mean that they should be defended. Vladimir Putin is a reaction.
Has invaded another country, and he's a dictator.
Vladimir Putin is a very nasty, reactionary, conservative leader who's been in power for 25 years, who invaded another country. Okay. That should be opposed, absolutely. So, for example, I think that where Britain does put money into Ukraine, it should be on securing the peace deal. So I wouldn't want us to send arms which could be used to extend that war. But I do think a commitment to peacekeepers is a very sensible
thing. So you would have British boots on the ground in Ukraine?
As peacekeepers, as part of a peace agreement.
Such a bizarre, I suppose, is it a bizarre interviewing style, or is it an interviewing style that sort of gets fused because you're intentionally trying to rile up your interviewee? David, if you won't call Putin Hitler, you're defending Putin. It is the kind of, it's funny because it's ridiculous, but it is also the kind of journalism that is quite worrying, actually, in times of, war and peace. You'll remember sort of the same narrative being used about Saddam Hussein before the Iraq War. I had the historian Richard Evans on last Friday, who was talking about how Nasser was compared to Hitler before the Suez Crisis, when we tried to take back the Suez Canal by military force, when he was an Arab nationalist who was actually bringing about some pretty impressive development in his country. What did you make of that exchange? I know James Schneider is a colleague of yours.
Yeah, I should probably recuse myself from the segment, but I would reinforce his point. I mean, I would have responded to the last point about an invasion by reiterating that the United States and the United Kingdom invaded another sovereign country, Iraq. I mean, as well as raining bombs and initiating regime change in Libya and leading many other such regime change operations. I mean, if Ed Balls is not prepared to call George W. Bush, for example, paint him with the same brush as Hitlerian in that way, and be prepared to fight him on that terrain, then I think we are in another kind of conceptual universe than the one he'd like us to live in, which is to think about Ukraine as a purifying, holy, spiritual war of good versus evil, in the ways that I know from my many years living on your cursed island, many yearn for that Manichaean universe from 80 years ago. But there's a deeper point that I would make, which I'm sure James, as the comms guru he is, would have made elsewhere in the argument, about rearming Europe, as Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the EU Commission, has made, and as Keir Starmer has also made, which is that there is a false equivalence. There's a false comparison that's being made between the two sides of the Atlantic, or the two major partners in NATO, the United States and the UK and Europe. The idea being that there is always extra cash. There's always a bucket of money for defense. When US Americans, as we like to do, say that a bomb being sent to Israel is a school that's not being built in Kentucky, there is a certain degree at a level there of truth. But the reality is, and we need to be honest about this, that the fiscal and monetary privileges that have been endowed to the United States through the international systems of trade and finance, through the global supremacy of the dollar, mean that trade-off is not so biting. It's not so real. It is not actually the case that a bomb being produced and paid for by the United States means that we're stripping funding elsewhere in the US social or welfare state, which is only to say that every time we do slash those budgets, it is out of a sense of cruelty, not necessity. And that relates back to the earlier point about the Labour Party's present pursuit of welfare budget cuts, and how fascinating it is that all roads, social democratic and hard right reactionary, seem to lead to one inevitable outcome, which is hitting the poorest hardest. However, it is the case that in Europe, when Ursula von der Leyen says, all of a sudden, we've found this big bucket of money to rearm Europe, that there is a zero-sum logic at play in Europe's security strategy. That is to say, the European Union has not found new money because there is no new money to find. Similar to the Green Deal, for example, which was supposed to be its landmark man-on-the-moon mission to drive Europe's green transition, the plan to rearm Europe is a reshuffling of money. Every euro that is taken to buy a bomb from a US-American defense contractor is a euro that is taken out of the pension of a retired family in Andalusia or in Thessaloniki or in Warsaw, right? It is simply the case that in this constrained fiscal environment of the Eurozone in particular, and you could make the case in the UK, although I don't want to get into an argument about monetary theories, that there is more of a zero-sum logic at play there. And I think that's really where we have to be fighting this fight. James is right to ask the basic question of whether these plans to increase defense budgets do indeed make us safer. And my expectation is that advancing a politics of anti-militarism and peace, as we do from our Progressive International, is to represent not even a silent majority, but a significant and quite vocal majority across the most of Europe. I do not think it is the case that a community in Porto, Portugal, or in Barcelona, Spain, or in Bordeaux, France, feels that there is an imminent risk tomorrow that Putin will arrive on their doorstep. And they should be asking the hard question, is this increase in our budget for defense, which shouldn't even call it defense, for buying weapons, going to make us safe? And what does safety mean? I mean, we enter into a really fascinating and philosophical terrain about positive and negative freedoms, because it is the case that whatever negative freedom that is supposedly, and James is right to even question the veracity of this, will make that family safer for some hypothetical invasion that is in no way perceived by any true expert of defense to be imminent on the continent of Europe, right? It is right to ask at what cost that will come, because it will impoverish the people of Europe, and it will be deployed. Those weapons will be deployed, if not in Moscow, then in Kabul, or indeed on the South Pacific, somewhere else. Because the only way to make that warfare economy work is to keep buying, to keep producing, to keep making these weapons. So it's not the case that you just buy a bunch of bombs and then keep them in storage. If you want to run a warfare economy, which is what the Europe is preparing to do, great FT article from its least distinguished opinion writer saying that if Europe wants to make a warfare state, it has to trim away its welfare state. To keep that warfare state running, you have to keep buying stuff. You have to keep producing weapons, and to keep producing weapons to justify it, you start to have to dropping bombs. You have to start using those weapons, and that's, I think, what James is articulating. The self-fulfilling prophecy of these defense budget raises this defense expenditure, because it creates this not just a bellicose logic, but a certain, August 1914 craze to say, well, if we're going to be at war, we're going to be at war. And I think it's critical and incumbent upon us, especially our generation, to try to be clear-minded and cool-headed about what the present geopolitical juncture is, what kind of threats a country like Great Britain, and I would argue no one gives enough of a fuck about Great Britain to invade it right now. And I'll eat my book, in the words of Matt Goodwin, if I'm wrong about this, to justify this massive increase in defense expenditure when it will inevitably and indeed come at the cost of people's lives and livelihoods across the country.